John, Charlotte Bronte, I think, said the passions are perfectly unknown to her, talking about Jane Austen. Was it nonsense?
I think it was nonsense to say that. Actually, I mean, it's interesting. She said that, I think, in a letter to George Eliot's partner, George Henry Lewis, and it's funny that she did that because she clearly only read Pride and Prejudice because Lewis said, "Here's this writer who's as good as Shakespeare," and Charlotte Bronte never come across her, and was amazed, and couldn't understand why Lewis thought she was so wonderful. And I think there were quite a lot of Victorians. I mean, Charlotte Bronte was not unusual in that there were quite a lot of Victorians who either hadn't come to Jane Austen at all or didn't see that she was the great writer that she's now commonly perceived to be. I mean, the thing about the passions is interesting because, of course, Pride and Prejudice is a novel which is all about button-downness in a way. And I think a lot of contemporary readers, a lot of readers now, would think of Mr. Darcy as a kind of, as a closed furnace of feeling.
Yes, exactly. A sort of portrait of infatuation,
absolutely,
really,
and a man who expresses himself, notably most of the time, either by silence. A lot of the time when he and Elizabeth are together, the word silent is used for what they do together.
He's always staring at her, isn't he?
And he smiles at her. That's the crucial thing. That's how you know that there's something there. There's a voltage there, which is that he smiles some 8 or 9 times in the course of the novel, and it's always at her. And but you know, it's an extraordinary thing because if you compare, say, what happens between the two so-called lovers in Pride and Prejudice to what happens between Jane Eyre and Mr. Rochester in Jane Eyre, you've got to realise Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy are only alone together once in the novel before he starts coming to Kent to sit there and just stare at her and be silent. So in the section of the novel that happens in Hertfordshire, they're alone once together when she's staying at Netherfield because her sister is ill there. And in the course of that time, he just reads. He says nothing. He's completely silent because he fears he'll give her too much encouragement if he speaks. So what really happens, their attraction grows in this really strange business of either them sort of fencing with each other conversationally with other people around.
And there's an erotic charge
in
that.
Yeah, definitely. Or, I mean, and this is the real, I think, expression of the erotic charge, when they're dancing. Dancing's the whole of the first third of the novel expresses, in a very characteristic way for Jane Austen, expresses the mixture of formality and passion, I would say, or let's say formality and sensuality, by, first of all, having him snub her at a dance, and then he tries to ask her to dance, and she much more wittily snubs him, and then eventually they do dance together, and they talk as they dance. And that sort of seems to me in some ways a representation of how Austen deals with what Charlotte Bronte would call passion, but in a way that Charlotte Bronte just couldn't refuse to recognise.
Yeah, refused to recognise. Yeah. Of course, they both change in the novel, don't they? Elizabeth is quite blind. She gets everything wrong at first. She totally gets him wrong. And he changes too, don't they? They change as they grow together, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, the process of characters changing in Jane Austen is, I think, very important because one of the great things about her as a novelist is her acceptance that most people don't change. You know, in lots of novels by people like Dickens, people, especially minor characters, they're reformed, they're taught lessons, they change. But at the end of Pride and Prejudice, Lydia Bennet is Lydia Bennet.
Still Lydia Bennet.
Yeah.
And so is Lizzie still Lizzie.
And Mrs. Bennet is still, she says, I wish I could say Mrs. Bennet became a wise, sensible woman, but no, she's just the same. But Elizabeth, like other Austen heroines, does change, especially in as she recognises that she's been wrong. Yeah. She's deluded herself. And of course, Austen novels are all full of self-deluded characters, but the difference between the heroines and the other ones is that the heroines have to recognise and to some extent be sort of mortified by the fact that they've made mistakes.
Yeah.
Mr. Darcy too changes in as much as he is this brooding, difficult man who is the target for every young woman or every mother of every marriageable young woman around. So he's developed this kind of carapace, and it's there brilliantly in the opening section of the novel when he arrives at the Meryton Assembly Ball, and he won't even allow himself to be introduced to anybody in order to dance with them. So he's Mr. Noli Me Tangere, and he's broken down, and he has to have this mortifying, humiliating experience of proposing and being turned down, and being turned down in the most dismissive, brilliantly dismissive, scornful way by Elizabeth. Allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you. Bang! He's swatted aside. Now,
and for the first time there, we see his passion. Don't we? I mean, we see it and hear it in words.
Well, we see it, of course, his passion, because it's the most hopeless proposal. It's worse than Mr. Collins. And Mr. Collins is positively gracious compared to Mr. Darcy, because Mr. Darcy essentially says to Elizabeth, everything about you is bad, bad, bad. Your family is appalling. Your social standing is terrible. But I've got to have you. I've got to have you. And the only way he's going to get Elizabeth is marrying her. He's a gentleman, and he recognises that she will only, to be blunt, she's only going to sleep with a man who'll marry her. Yeah. He's got to marry her. And he proposes, of course, the fatal thing in Jane Austen. And I'd say it's one of my rules, it's one of Jane Austen's rules. If a man proposes as if he cannot imagine that the answer would be no, the answer will be no. Yes. That's it.
Yes, you say this in your recent book.
Yes, the only successful proposal is the one which is anxious. The only successful man is the man who thinks he might be turned down. And
of course, Darcy turns into
He turns into that man. He is, in his way, humbled. Pride and Prejudice, his pride is brought low, and he learns, in a sense, to be grateful for that fact, because he's taken pride in his pride, as it were. And he and Elizabeth, in a famous exchange, have discussed it earlier in the novel, and he's learnt to sort of give it up, and that's a big change.
Big change. What do you think the novel tells us about marriage? Do you think that Jane Austen was ambivalent about the whole marriage thing? Or?
I think it's too often said that Austen's novels, and Pride and Prejudice in particular, show us that marriage was, as Mary Crawford says in Mansfield Park, a manoeuvring business.
Yeah.
Famously, we have the marriage of Charlotte Lucas and Mr. Collins, which is often taken as a sort of object lesson. Jane Austen showing us what marriage was like in the early 19th century, and that's the sort of feminist Jane Austen. Jane Austen, the cold-eyed analyst of the marriage business. But I mean, it is striking that in Pride and Prejudice, as in all other Jane Austen novels, it's an absolute given that the heroine will only marry for love. And in a completely uncompromising way. After all, Elizabeth, whom we know, she doesn't know, we know she fancies this guy, Mr. Darcy, he is one of the most eligible men in Britain. He proposes to her, and out of a mixture of misunderstanding, wounded feelings, anger at the way that he's dealt with her sister, she turns him down. And it's quite clear that almost nobody else in the country would have turned him down, but she does, and we are supposed to admire her for that fact. And, Jane Austen is, of course, she's a realist about the marriage business, but she's also, as somebody who seems to believe, or invites us to believe, as Catherine Morland says in Northanger Abbey, to marry without love is wicked, says Catherine Morland. I mean, she's a naive 17-year-old girl, but our hearts are supposed to sort of chime with that, I think.
And yet Charlotte probably, her chances were much more limited. She's not as pretty as Elizabeth, she's not as clever, so she marries for a different reason.
Absolutely.
I was just going to ask you one final question, which is about, brings us on to it really, the whole question of happiness in Prejudice. There's a lot about happiness, isn't there? And Lizzie talks about how she's going to forget her past, and that's how she'll be happy. And I think that everyone accepts that Jane, her sister, who's got this very quiet temperament, probably will be the happiest of all.
Yes.
What do you think she's telling us about happiness in the book?
Well, I mean, it's quite clear in the book that a happy marriage is quite a rare thing. And the whole of the book takes place against the background of what in some sense we must call an unhappy marriage of Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. And indeed everything in Pride and Prejudice that goes wrong is Mr. Bennet's fault, really.
Absolutely.
You know, particularly the whole subplot, which is very important, of Lydia, Lydia's elopement. Well, we call it an elopement. That implies marriage at the end of it, but of course they don't get married, and that's the terrible thing. So, and that's all Mr. Bennet's fault, really. And it's Mr. Bennet's fault there's no money, because Mr. Bennet spent it all. I mean, he's actually, his income's quite large, and there's the mystery of how he could have married Mrs. Bennet, a mystery which is addressed in the novel, and we're told he fancied her, really, and he married her because he fancied her, and people have commented a good deal, I think, about the relative absence of happy marriages in the Austen world. The Jane and Mr. Bingley marriage, which indeed we're encouraged to think will be happy, it's a marriage of love and of mutual attraction and respect and so on. But I think for the reader, it's a rather non-existent relationship. I mean, it's quite striking that we never hear them talking to each other, Mr. Bingley and Jane. We're often told that they are, as it were, muttering sweet nothings to each other. But we don't get any of that dialogue at all. And implicitly the reason is because it'd be so boring. And there would be none of that sort of Benedict and Beatrice, Mirabell and Millamant fencing that you get with Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth. So there is a sense that model of happiness is at best a bit anemic.
Yeah.
And yes, that we're encouraged to think that the Mr. Darcy Elizabeth thing is they are going to have a happy marriage, and the reason is that, as Mr. Bennet says, from one side he says, are you sure you're right when Elizabeth tells him about it, because you could never be happy with the man you respect. But also, I think that thing that Mr. Darcy's sister Georgiana sort of rather shocks her, that Elizabeth teases Mr. Darcy. The mutual teasing is very, very important. Nobody except for Mr. Bennet understands Elizabeth's sense of humour, except the reader. Mr. Darcy's the only one who gets it, and he's the only one who's up to her. Yeah. And it's that sense that actually they're two characters who are they're destined for each other, because no one else understands what they're talking about, actually. And in that sense, they are going to be happy